I didn't grow up believing in fairy tales, but I'd be lying if I said my relationship with Mark didn't feel close to one. 6 years. 6 years of laughing at the same stupid jokes, finishing each other's sentences, and building a life together that felt solid, safe, real. He was the first person I ever fell in love with. The first man who saw past my awkward quirks and made me feel like I was enough. Mark was the kind of guy you read about in sappy romance novels. Thoughtful, patient, the type who remembered how I liked my coffee and would leave little notes in my bag before work. When my world felt like it was falling apart, he'd piece it back together with nothing but a hug and a few soft-spoken words. He wasn't just my boyfriend. He was my anchor, and I loved him. God, I loved him. But there was one thing we didn't talk about. Not really. It's not in any way that mattered. Our intimacy of physical intimacy wasn't just irregular. It was practically non-existent. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that he was probably just tired or stressed. I rationalized it every way I could. He worked long hours. Maybe he wasn't a very physical person. Or maybe I just wasn't doing enough to spark his interest. But as months turned into years, I couldn't ignore the growing frustration gnawing at me from the inside out. It wasn't just about the act itself, which was about feeling wanted, desired, like I mattered in a way that went beyond love. I tried everything: candlelit dinners, weekend getaways, even lingerie that made me blush just looking at it in the mirror. But nothing worked. Mark would always smile, kiss my forehead, and tell me he loved me. And that was it. I never doubted that he loved me. But I started to doubt if that love was enough. At first, I kept those thoughts buried. I didn't want to ruin what we had by bringing them up. I was terrified of hearing something I couldn't unhear. What if it wasn't stress or exhaustion? What if he simply didn't find me attractive anymore? So I stayed silent, convincing myself that love was enough to fill the void. Until the night of the party. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a casual get-together with a few friends. Mark had opted to stay home, claiming he had some work to catch up on. He kissed me on the cheek before I left and told me to have fun. I should have stayed home, too. It started off harmlessly enough. A few drinks, a lot of laughs, and the familiar comfort of old friends. David, in particular, had always been a bit of a flirt. It was just his personality, playful and charming, and I never thought much of it. But that night, something was different. Maybe it was the wine. Or maybe it was the way David's attention lingered on me longer than usual. His jokes just a little more suggestive. I remember the warmth of his hand brushing against mine as he passed me a drink. I remember the way his voice dropped when he leaned in close and whispered something. What? I can't recall. But I remember the way it made my stomach flutter. After that, everything became a blur. I don't remember how we ended up alone together. I don't remember the exact moment things crossed the line. All I remember are flashes. His hands gripping my waist. His lips grazing my neck. The sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a bed that wasn't mine. For a moment, I thought it was all a bad dream. But then I turned my head and saw him, David, lying beside me, the sheets tangled around his body. And that's when reality hit me like a freight train. I cheated, the word felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me. I wasn't that person. I wasn't the type to betray the person I loved most in the world. But I had. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts that all led to the same inescapable truth. I had done the one thing I swore I'd never do. The worst part? I didn't feel anything. No regret, no guilt, not even anger at myself for what I'd done. All I felt was numbness, until I got home and saw Mark's face. He was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone like it was any other morning. When he looked up and smiled at me, I felt something inside me crack. I wanted to tell him right then and there to fall at his feet and beg for forgiveness. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I kissed him on the cheek, told him I wasn't feeling well, and locked myself in the bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, searching for some trace of the girl I used to be. The girl who loved Mark with everything she had, who would have done anything to make him happy. But all I saw was a stranger. I knew I couldn't keep it from him. I couldn't carry the weight of my betrayal alone. He deserved to know the truth, and so, a week later, I told him. The day I confessed was one of the longest days of my life. I spent hours pacing the apartment, rehearsing my words over and over again in my head. How do you even start a conversation like that? Hey, Mark, remember how I said I loved you more than anything? Well, funny story. ... No, there was no way to soften the blow. No way to frame it in a way that wouldn't shatter him. And yet, I knew I had to do it. The truth was a weight I couldn't carry any longer. Mark came home around at 6. Tired but smiling like he always did. He leaned down to kiss me on the forehead, before heading to the fridge to grab a drink. It was such a small, everyday gesture, but it made my chest ache with guilt. "Hey babe," he said, popping open a soda. "How was your day?" "Fine," I mumbled, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. He must have noticed something was off because he turned to look at me, his brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, staring down into the abyss. Once I jumped, there'd be no going back. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "We need to talk." Mark froze. I saw the shift in his expression, the way his smile faded and his shoulders tensed. "Okay," he said cautiously, setting his drink down on the counter. "What's going on?" I couldn't look at him. I stared at the floor, my voice barely above a whisper as I said, "I did something. Something I'm not proud of." Silence. I could feel his eyes on me, feel the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "What did you do?" My hands were trembling. I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. "At the party last week, I drank too much, and the words wouldn't come. Tears welled up in my eyes as I forced myself to look at him. "I cheated on you." For a moment, Mark didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me like he didn't recognize me. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "What?" "It was a mistake," I said quickly, my voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear. I was drunk, and I stopped." The word hit me like a slap. Mark took a step back, his face a mixture of shock and pain. "You cheated on me?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you. I swear I do." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a bitter, hollow sound that made my stomach twist. "You love me," he said, his voice rising. "Is that what love looks like to you? Getting drunk and hooking up with someone else?" "I made a mistake," I pleaded. "A horrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything. Please, Mark. You have to believe me." "Believe you?" He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room like he didn't know what to do with himself. "How am I supposed to believe anything you say after this?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was sit there, watching as the man I loved unraveled in front of me. For hours we went back and forth. Mark asked question after question who it was, how it happened, why I didn't stop it. Each answer felt like another dagger to his heart. By the end of the night, we were both exhausted. He sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands, while I sat across from him, my face red and swollen from crying. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Case said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His words cut deeper than anything else he'd said that night. But I couldn't blame him. How could I? "I understand," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor like he was trying to make sense of it all. For the next few days, we barely spoke. Mark slept on the couch, and I spent most of my time holed up in the bedroom, replaying everything in my head. I kept waiting for him to say something, to yell, to cry, to leave, but he didn't. And then, one night, he came into the bedroom and sat down beside me. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "about us. About everything." I held my breath, afraid of what he was going to say next. "I can't just forget what you did," he continued. "And I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you. But I don't want to lose you." Relief washed over me, but it was, quickly, replaced by guilt. Mark was willing to give me another chance, even after everything I'd done. And I wasn't sure I deserved it. "I'll make it up to you," I promised. "I'll do whatever it takes." Mark nodded, but the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. "We'll see." After Mark forgave me, I thought I'd finally hit rock bottom, that the worst was behind us. But what no one tells you about forgiveness is how heavy it can feel. I carried it with me every day, a quiet reminder of what I'd done and what I stood to lose if I ever slipped up again. For a while, I tried harder than ever to fix things. I planned date nights, surprised Mark with little gestures, and made an effort to show him how much he meant to me. And he tried, too. He really did. But no matter how hard we worked, there was this distance between us. Something fragile and unspoken that neither of us could name, but both of us felt. It lingered like a shadow over our lives, subtle, but always there, and the issue that had started it all, the lack of physical intimacy, was still unresolved. If anything, it had gotten worse. Mark couldn't touch me without hesitation, and I couldn't look at him without remembering the hurt in his eyes. The night I confessed, I told myself we just needed time, that if we were patient and kept trying, we'd find our way back to each other. But patience has never been my strong suit. That's how I ended up seeing David again. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. He texted me a few weeks after the party, something casual like, "Hey, haven't seen you around. Hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I knew what I should have done: ignored it, deleted it, and moved on. But instead, I replied, "I'm fine. You?" One message turned into 2, then 3. Before I knew it, we were texting almost every day. At first, it was innocent enough. We talked about work, mutual friends, stupid things we'd seen online. But then the tone shifted. David had always been bold, the kind of guy who said whatever was on his mind without thinking twice. And now he was saying things I had no business hearing. Compliments that lingered a little too long. Jokes that made my cheeks flush. Questions about Mark that I didn't want to answer, but did anyway. I should have stopped it. I should have deleted his number and cut off contact the moment things started to cross the line. But I didn't. I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The first time I met him again, in person, it was under the guise of catching up. We agreed to grab a drink after work, something casual and low-key. I told myself it was just a friendly outing. Nothing more. But the second I saw him, all the excuses I'd made for myself fell apart. David hadn't changed at all. He still had that same cocky grin, that same easy confidence that made it impossible to look away. And when he hugged me, holding me just a little too tightly, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in months. We sat at the bar, talking and laughing like old friends. But there was an undercurrent to everything he said, a tension that hung in the air between us. "You look good," he said at one point, his eyes lingering on me in a way that made my stomach flutter. Better than I remember. I laughed it off, pretending his words didn't affect me. But they did. When he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper, I didn't pull away. When his hand brushed against mine, I didn't move. And when he asked me to come back to his place, I didn't say no. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew I was risking everything: Mark's trust, our relationship, everything we'd worked so hard to rebuild. But in that moment, all I could think about was how alive David made me feel. It was reckless, stupid, selfish. But it didn't stop me. That night, David didn't just cross the line. He obliterated it. He wasn't gentle or hesitant like Mark. He was bold, demanding, unapologetic, and I let him do whatever he wanted. I gave him parts of myself I'd never even shown Mark. When it was over, I didn't feel the same crushing guilt I'd felt the first time. If anything, I felt relieved. Like I'd finally scratched an itch. I'd been ignoring for far too long. But the relief was short-lived as I lay there in David's bed. Staring at the ceiling, the weight of what I'd done began to sink in. I'd betrayed Mark again, and this time I didn't have the excuse of being drunk or caught up in the moment. This time I'd made a conscious choice. I knew I should end things with David, cut him off before things got any worse. But as I got dressed and said goodbye, he pulled me close and whispered, "See you soon." And I didn't correct him. Living a double life is exhausting. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between the man I loved and the man I couldn't seem to let go of. With Mark, I was careful, attentive, desperate to prove that I was still the person he fell in love with. I made his favorite meals, remembered the small details he mentioned in passing, and laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was broken between us. His smiles didn't reach his eyes anymore. And his touch, when he offered it, felt more like a formality than an expression of love. I told myself that it wasn't entirely my fault, that Mark shared some of the blame for the widening gap between us. If he would just talk to me, if he'd let me in, maybe I wouldn't feel so drawn to someone else. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. The truth was, I was addicted to the way David made me feel. With him, I didn't have to pretend to be perfect or carry the weight of my guilt. He didn't ask for anything other than the version of me that craved chaos and thrilled. It didn't matter to David that I had a boyfriend. In fact, he seemed to relish it. "You're wasting your time with him," he said one night, his voice laced with mockery as he traced lazy circles on my bare shoulder. "If he can't give you what you need, why are you still with him?" Didn't have an answer. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit the truth, that despite everything, I still loved Mark. David laughed when I didn't respond, leaning in close to whisper, "You know, he doesn't deserve you." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. I knew what I was doing was unfair to Mark, that I was tearing apart the trust he'd so reluctantly given back to me. But no matter how many times I told myself it had to stop, I kept going back to David. The thrill of sneaking around, the way my heart raced whenever he texted, the heat of his hands on my skin, it was intoxicating. But living two lives meant living with constant fear. Every time Mark asked where I'd been or why I was late coming home, I felt my stomach drop. I started rehearsing excuses before I even needed them, crafting stories that I hoped sounded convincing. I stayed late. At work, I'd say, or I ran into an old friend and lost track of time. Mark never pressed too hard, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The way his questions lingered even after I gave him an answer. One night, he caught me off guard. We were sitting on the couch, half watching a show we'd both seen a dozen times before. I was scrolling through my phone, deleting messages from David when Mark spoke up. "Who's that?" My heart stopped. I glanced at him, trying to gauge whether his tone was casual or suspicious. "Just a friend," I said, forcing a smile. "Why?" "No reason," he said, his eyes fixed on the TV, but his jaw was tight, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. It was a small moment, but it felt like a crack in the facade I'd so carefully built. The closer Mark came to uncovering the truth, the more reckless David became. He started pushing boundaries, texting me at odd hours, even showing up at places where he knew Mark might see him. "Relax," he'd say when I confronted him about it. "He's not going to figure it out. And if he does, maybe it's for the best." I hated how casually he dismissed my fear, how little he seemed to care about the consequences. But at the same time, his confidence was part of what drew me to him. He was everything Mark wasn't: bold, unapologetic, and unafraid to take what he wanted. The turning point came one night when David invited me over, and I made the mistake of going. We were in the middle of things when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again and again, David glanced at the screen and smirked. "Your boyfriend's looking for you," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Don't," I warned, reaching for the phone. But David grabbed it before I could, holding it just out of reach. He said, his grin widening. "I just want to see what he's saying." "Give it back," I said, My voice sharper now. He ignored me, scrolling through the messages with a mocking laugh. "You're late again?" he read aloud. "He's worried about you." "Cute, David. I'm serious. Give it back." He finally handed the phone over, but the damage was done. The look on his face, the smugness, the complete lack of remorse made my stomach churn. "Why do you let him control you like that?" David said as I got dressed, his tone more annoyed than anything else. "You're wasting your time pretending to be the perfect girlfriend when you're here with me." I didn't respond. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. As I drove home that night, the weight of everything started to suffocate me. Mark's face flashed in my mind, followed by the memory of David's grin as he mocked him. What was I doing? I loved Mark. I knew that much. But if I truly loved him, how could I keep doing this to him? And yet, as I pulled into the driveway and saw the light on in the living room, my resolve crumbled. I wasn't ready to face the truth, not yet. So, I put on a smile, walked through the door, and pretended everything was fine. Asterisk secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly you try to hold them together. I had spent months weaving lies into the fabric of my life, convincing myself that I could keep the threads from coming loose. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. It started with the small things. Mark began asking more questions: where I was going, who I was with, why I was late coming home. His tone was never accusatory, but there was an edge to it. A quiet suspicion that made my heart race every time he spoke. "I called your office earlier," he said one evening as I was setting the table for dinner. "You weren't there." Froze, the plates trembling slightly in my hands. "Oh, had to step out for a bit. I had a meeting off-site." Mark nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. "Funny, your assistant didn't mention any meeting." I felt my stomach twist. "It must have been a last-minute thing," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. He didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his fork and began eating in silence. But the tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling as guilt gnawed at me. I wanted to tell him everything, to rip off the bandage and face the consequences. But the fear of losing him kept my mouth shut. David, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on the chaos. "He knows, doesn't he?" he said one afternoon as we lay tangled in his sheets. "No," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. David smirked, propping himself up on one elbow to look at me. "Come on, babe. He's not that stupid. He's probably just waiting for you to slip up." "Don't call me that," I snapped, sitting up and pulling the blanket around me. "What, babe?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. I glared at him, but he just laughed. "Relax," he said, running a hand through his hair. "You're so tense all the time. You're gonna give yourself a heart attack." His nonchalance made my blood boil. I hated how little he seemed to care about the mess we were creating. How easily he dismissed the gravity of the situation. "Maybe we should stop," I said suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could think them through. David raised an eyebrow, his smirk fading slightly. "Stop what?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Whatever this is, it's not right." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed a low, bitter sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Right?" he said, sitting up and swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Because you're such a saint, huh?" "That's not what I meant," I said, my voice trembling. David stood up and began getting dressed, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You know what your problem is," Kay said, pulling on his shirt. "You're too scared to make a choice. You want to keep playing house with your boyfriend while sneaking around with me. And you think you can get away with it forever?" I don't think that, I said, my voice rising. "Don't you?" he shot back, his eyes blazing. "You don't love him, really. If you did, you wouldn't be here." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. David grabbed his jacket and turned to face me one last time. "You need to figure out what you want," he said, coldly, "because I'm not going to wait around for you to grow a spine." He left without another word, slamming the door behind him. For the first time since the affair started, I felt truly alone. The next few days were a blur. I avoided David's calls and texts, hoping the silence would give me some clarity. All it did was amplify my guilt and confusion. And then it happened. It was a Saturday evening, and Mark and I were getting ready to go out for dinner. I was in the bathroom, fixing my hair, when I heard his voice call out from the bedroom. "Who's David?" My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my stomach churning as I walked into the bedroom. Mark was standing by the bed, holding my phone in his hand. The screen was lit up with a message from David. "Miss you? When can I see you again?" "I can explain," I stammered, my mind racing for an excuse. Mark's face was a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Explain what?" he said, his voice trembling. "That you've been lying to me? That you've been cheating on me again?" Tears filled my eyes as I tried to reach for him, but he stepped back, his expression cold and distant. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Just don't." For the first time, I saw the full extent of the damage I'd caused. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a betrayal, one that had shattered the foundation of our relationship. "I love you," I whispered, the words sounding hollow even to me. Mark laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't know what love is," he said. And with that, he walked out the door, leaving me alone in the ruins of what we once had. The silence in the apartment after Mark left was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that screamed at you, made your thoughts louder, more unbearable. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the open door, praying that he would come back. But the only thing that came was the crushing realization that I had lost him. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the pain, the anger, the disbelief. I heard his words echoing in my head over and over again. "You don't know what love is." Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't know what love was anymore. By morning, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a freight train. Mark wasn't just angry or hurt, he was gone, and I didn't know if he was ever coming back. I tried calling him, but every call went straight to voicemail. I sent texts, long, rambling messages, begging him to come home, to let me explain, but there was no response. For days, I waited. I barely ate, barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, only to feel my heart sink when I saw it wasn't him. The emptiness of the apartment mirrored the emptiness inside me, and for the first time, I truly understood what it meant to be alone. And then there was David. He called me a few days after the fight, his tone casual, almost amused. "Hey, haven't heard from you? Everything okay?" I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that nothing was okay, that everything was falling apart because of what we'd done. But instead, I just said, "Mark found out." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then David let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's rough. That's all you have to say?" I snapped, my voice shaking. "My life is falling apart, and you're acting like it's no big deal. What do you want me to say?" He shot back, his tone defensive. "You knew this was going to happen eventually." "I didn't think it would happen like this," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. David sighed, and for a moment I thought he was going to apologize. But instead, he said, "Look, maybe this is for the best. Now you don't have to keep pretending." "Pretending what?" "That you're happy with him," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "Come on, you and I both know you were just going through the motions. Maybe now you can finally move on." Move on. The words made my stomach churn. Was that really what I wanted? To move on with David, to build a life with someone who had only ever seen me as a temporary thrill. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. David didn't argue, but I could hear the impatience in his voice when he said, "Take all the time you need. Just don't take forever." When I hung up the phone, I felt more lost than ever. The days stretched into weeks, and still, there was no word from Mark. Every morning, I woke up hoping he would call or text, but the silence remained unbroken. I went through the motions of my daily life work, errands, The occasional forced conversation with friends, but nothing felt real. It was like I was living in a fog, disconnected from everything around me. One night, I finally worked up the courage to go to his parents' house, hoping he might be there. But when his mother answered the door, her expression said it all. She knew. "He doesn't want to see you," she said, her voice cold and distant. "You should leave." Her words stung, but I couldn't blame her. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and walked away without looking back. By the time I got home, I was a wreck. I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the things Mark and I had built together. The photos on the walls, the little trinkets we'd picked up on vacations, the blanket he always insisted on using, even though it was too small. And, for the first time, let myself feel the full weight of my mistakes. I thought about all the times I could have stopped. All the chances I'd had to walk away from David before it got this far. I thought about the way Mark had looked at me the night I confessed the first time. The way he'd fought to forgive me, even though I didn't deserve it. I had destroyed the best thing in my life. Not because I didn't love him, but because I hadn't been brave enough to confront the cracks in our relationship. Instead of facing the truth, I'd chosen to run to someone who made me feel wanted, even if it was temporary. The next morning, I made a decision. I deleted David's number, blocked him on every platform I could think of. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase what I'd done or undo the pain I'd caused, but it was a start. I didn't know if Mark would ever forgive me again. I didn't even know if I deserved his forgiveness. But I knew I couldn't keep living the way I had been. For the first time in months, I was alone, truly alone. And maybe that was what I needed. To sit with the mess I'd made, to figure out who I was and what kind of person I wanted to be. Mark might never come back. But if he did, I wanted to be someone worth coming back to. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of my mistakes would follow me wherever I went. But as I stood in the quiet of the apartment, I realized that the only way to move forward was to start taking responsibility for my choices one step at a time. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comment side. Love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.